a panel of people who have some viewpoints, their personal viewpoints on the audit aspects. So for those people you know my voice by now, and you know that I have a job title that says Regional Vice President of GRC Solutions, I come with a background of about 10 to 15 years in various roles around process and audit and compliance. So I joined MetricStream a couple of years ago, and I work with some significant companies across all industries and across Europe. So what I'd like to do, as we do with the other sessions, is that I'll ask each of the team, each of the panelists to introduce themselves, a little bit about themselves and their current job role and any relevant experience, and perhaps comment on the company that they work for, and if necessary and if you feel appropriate, because bear in mind the panelists are representing their own views, not those of the company, a little bit about the company if it's relevant in this context. So let's start with Lorraine. So we have Lorraine Scaramanga, who she chairs audit committees for some subsidiaries of Eurobank in the Balkans. So.
Yes, just a couple of words about myself. I have a Greek surname, but I'm a bit of an imposter. I went to Greece 30 years ago. I'm married to a Greek. We went for 2 years, but I'm still there. I really have an external audit background. I was an audit partner with PwC in Athens for many years. I was responsible for financial services for a few of those years. So I suppose the majority of my experience really comes from what you call the fourth line of defense. I've spent a few years as a finance director of a shipping group as well. And more recently, I've been chairing audit committees for Eurobank subsidiaries out of Greece.
Thank you. And we have Kenneth Wainwright, who's an audit director with Citi.
So I'm an audit director in Citi's risk audit department, and I cover risk governance frameworks, operational risk management, and all things risk and control self-assessment related. I cover mostly North America, EMEA, APAC, and the focus is very much on ensuring that we're aligned to things like Heinz standards and other emerging regulatory expectations, as well as the wider governance, risk and compliance piece. I've been at Citi for 3 years, and I've been in risk management and audit for about 20 years, but it's beginning to feel longer.
Thank you. And Spencer John, Chief Auditor in the COO part of Deutsche Bank.
Hi, so my name's Spencer John, as said, Chief Auditor for the Chief Operating Office for DB. I'm relatively new to internal audit, having spent most of my career in middle office and front office. So one of those people who often gets described as poacher turned gamekeeper. Been with DB for about 2.5 years, and I'll just echo what was said at the start. Everything I say today is definitely my own opinion, given where we are in the press at the moment. So.
Okay, thank you. And my pronunciation specialist, Fridthjof Roer, is the Chief Internal Auditor at Orkla.
Yes, I've been in Orkla for 23 years in the same position. Orkla is a listed company in Norway in branded consumer goods. And our main markets are the Nordic countries and Eastern Europe, and we have also operation in India.
Okay. Thank you. So, as we've heard from a number of the presentations today, and I think Marissa from OPAP, summed it up very well. Risk compliance and audit practitioners now have greater responsibilities than they've ever had, and greater opportunities at the same time. And there is sort of a momentum and increasing pressure to sort of integrate and collaborate more effectively across those lines of defence. So what I'd like to do, ask the panel, really, Kenneth, if I can start with yourself, what are some of the key driving factors of the convergence of second and third line of defence? Do you see any potential benefits? And, Would this approach help drive a risk-focused culture across an organisation?
Yeah, so I think if you start with the benefits, there are many, but it's quite a difficult place to get to. So if you think about it at the moment, senior management is struggling with a range of sort of complex reports that can be inconsistent in nature, so they'll tend to get a different view from different lines of defence. They may get different views externally as well. So you have this complexity and inconsistency, which if you start to integrate, you can get round to some extent. In addition, you can also start to close some of the gaps that you may have in coverage. So although you have 3 lines of defence or potentially 4 lines of defence, you don't necessarily know that there aren't any gaps in those 4 lines unless you start to integrate that approach. Thirdly, I'd say silos start to get broken down if you start to integrate. So that predominantly has a positive cost benefit. So it becomes a more efficient way to do things, and it starts to help you drive more value from those functions as opposed to having them sort of operate separately. In terms of impact on, let's just call it the business or first line as well, it sort of reduces the fatigue as well, because they start to see a coherent assessment-driven approach as opposed to, second line will ask something, audit will ask something, external audit will ask something, the regulators will come in and ask something else. So there tends to be this fatigue of answering similar questions through different lenses. And I think one final benefit that you would get is that in terms of risk profiling, you will get a more consistent view of what the correct risk profile is. So, at the moment, audit committees can tend to get different views, different risk profiles for the same risk, depending on how that's been approached. So, theoretically, you can get a lot of benefit. Getting there in practical terms is quite difficult.
Thank you. And as a sort of contrast from a differing industry, Fridthjof, do you have anything else to add?
Yes, I'm in an industry that is not that heavily regulated as your industries. And of course that will also have an influence on how we are organized. There is no obligation to have an internal audit, no obligation to have a compliance function. So just to give you a little bit of the perspective, why we are where we are today in my companies. I joined in 1994, and the internal audit at that time was only doing financial audits on behalf of the external auditor. And my first job was then to try to transform that into operational audit. And that took some actually 10 years before we had completed that transformation due to the people in the department and the competence in the department. But after 10 years, things had changed dramatically. You remember the Enron scandal, which put emphasis on the corporate governance issues. And that also led to a change for my role. It was used to be reporting to the CFO of our corporation. And then we changed it to the chief of staff. Mm-hmm. And after another year, the board of directors decided that they need to establish an audit committee. And then my line of reporting was changed then to the audit committee. And that is one thing that is fundamental for establishing a good internal audit. That is, the internal audit must be independent of the line management in order to do its job. And then at the same time, 10 years ago, the third line of defense model was emerged, and of course we then have adapted that into our company as well. And from that model, you know that the internal audit's main focus will be on governance, risk management, and compliance.
Okay, thank you. And Spencer, from your perspective, the again, potential benefits, anything that you has been missed out here, you think?
For me in particular, and especially having spent a lot of my career in middle office and some in front office, I think one of the biggest benefits I've seen of 3LOD is very much shining a spotlight onto the third line of defence, both in terms of raising the profile of internal audit departments, but also forcing the upskilling of the individual audit teams within those departments. I think if we go back probably 15, 20 years, I think it's night and day between the quality of and depth of skill in audit departments within financial services at the moment compared to what it was like 15, 20 years ago. The downside, if you ask me, of the Enron scandal is it shifted the market really into 100% controls-focused testing. And I think we've lost sight a little bit of why we're actually doing the testing in the first place and what the final product is of our company. So I think it's a journey. I think it's a necessary journey that we're on. But as I'll touch on later, I think there's still some way to go. But definitely for me, one of the biggest benefits is the upskilling and the bringing audit now on par with, in terms of reputation, quality, and the way audit is treated as a department.
Yeah, I would have thought that, I mean, one of the benefits should be that it should drive efficiency. And particularly in the world we live in at the moment, where resources, as you said in your with your introductory remarks, resources under a huge amount of pressure, particularly in my part of the world, where with the financial crisis that we're still going through, there's definitely a bit of a talent drain and ever-increasing expectations from regulators. So the scarce resources that we have need to be used in the most efficient way possibly.
Thank you. Yeah, I had a discussion not long ago actually with an audit director, and one of the biggest challenges as part of this was in fact, what do we not audit? And it was the integrated approach is what gives him the information and insight to know that he's auditing the right areas at the right time, because the board want to know what's not being audited. Thank you. So we've got efficiencies, we've got the raising of the profile of the audit department. That's one I hadn't anticipated actually. So thank you. We've got the breakdown of silos, and the filling of the gaps. You talked about fatigue, and that's definitely one that comes in and I've seen more and more often, not just in the three lines of defence, even just in compliance. You know, fatigues between different regulations, getting asked the same questions for different control tests. So, okay, we talked about integrated LOD model. What do we think the key elements of actually providing that model is? What are the responsibilities of an auditor in this sort of the integrated line of defence model, and how can auditors help ensure an effective LOD model? Fridthjof, do you want to?
Yes,
touch on
I
that
think
one?
it's important that we do not put ourselves into silos. We have been very open in my company that we should use the competence we have in the internal audit wherever it's suitable to use it. And I think it's appropriate to use it as long as we never forget that we are and shall be independent, and not take any responsibilities that should be with the line organization.
Okay, thank you. Lorraine, any comments?
Yes, I would pick up on the point that was made on independence. Obviously, I think the role of internal audit is to audit the effective operation of the first line of defence and of the second line of defence, and to provide feedback, appropriate feedback to management and to the audit committees. I think one of the other things, apart from the audit aspect of what the auditor does, is how can the third line of defence actually help the second line of defense. And I sometimes think that if you can get the third line of defense and the second line of defense to pick up a common cause, then they have a louder voice, and I think that can be beneficial as well.
Thank you. And I mean, on that note, and this is from both of your comments, we talked about, auditing has an output, okay, but in fact the presence of an effective and what's the word I want, the presence of an effective, legitimate and respected third line of defence is going to drive not only it's going to drive due process. So second line of defence gets more legitimacy. We're following the right process, not just ensuring that controls are effective, but actually how we go around managing those is taken seriously and in a common manner with the organisation. So that sort of takes me on to the third question, which I wanted to ask really, which is really the barriers and hurdles. Lorraine, so you sort of touched on a few things there. Convergence, big word. We've spent a little bit of time sort of touching on that, but I think we've used the term alignment here a few times. What do you think the barriers and hurdles are in terms of what's going to prevent this from happening effectively?
Well, I think I'm not going to say something new. I think I'm probably just going to pick up on some of the things that have been said over the last day or so. I think the whole idea of a common language is important. I think that often the three, risk, compliance, audit, don't necessarily express themselves in the same way, don't necessarily have the same definitions. So I think that's probably one of the challenges. And also not just the definition of the risk, but how they actually report it. As I think for audit committees as well, there can be a huge volume of information that's submitted to audit committees. So you get the submissions from all the different parties that are involved, and if they're not speaking the same language, it can be quite, there's a lot of duplication sometimes, and it's, it can be difficult to actually appreciate what the real risks are. So it can, I think that might be one of the hurdles. I suspect another issue is systems. If you don't have integrated systems, I think that must be one of the hurdles. I think priorities probably as well. I think potentially different priorities. We talked about silos earlier on. I'm not really just talking about silos, but just each function seeing what their own priorities are. So alignment of priorities, I think, is something else. I'll come back to my favorite one of resources, because obviously I think one of the hurdles must be resources and making sure you've got the right people in the right place. And communication, making sure that there are the effective communication channels, both formal communication channels and also the informal communication channels.
Language prioritization, resources, and communication channels. In fact,
and one other point, maturity,
yes.
I think,
maturity.
as well. Maturity.
Okay.
Not just in the organisation itself, but within the different divisions within an organisation.
There were 2 points that were raised about audit committees as we went through. Ken mentioned that there's a disparity in the information that can be provided, and you talked about maintaining effective independence. I mean, are those issues which you see at an audit committee level?
Sorry, you talked about volume of information that's submitted. I think that's definitely an issue. I think there's a lot of information that goes to the audit committee, and it's a question of sifting through it and really being able to pick out what's important and focus on it.
So, in terms of barriers and hurdles, Ken, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yes, so certainly I would echo what Lorraine is saying there, in that the taxonomy is a key thing, because if you have different taxonomies in different parts of the organisation, it's very, very difficult to aggregate a view. You then need to have some sort of common assessment methodology. because, if I call something effective and somebody else calls it good and somebody else calls it 3 and somebody else calls, it's very, very difficult to get an organised view of the world. And when you're providing that information to senior management, it just becomes confusing. I think the other thing I'd say is you need to try to flow everything from a risk. If you don't flow things from risks, it's very difficult to get that integrated view. So you take your risk and then you have the different responsibilities of the lines of defence aligned to that particular risk. You can then show what each line is doing, and you get that integrated view, and you have the same taxonomy, and you have the same assessment basis for that. I think another thing you need is a fairly strong risk culture, which aligns to your view on maturity. Because unless you're in a position to do that, it requires a certain intelligence to operate an integrated system. So if your organisation is happier working to a robust methodology that requires specific things to be tested at specific times, it's hard to make that intellectual shift. Risk appetite as well, unless you've got risk appetite reasonably well embedded, it's going to be tough to get to where you need to get to. And then I'd also say risk ownership. So in an ideal world, you would like each of your risks, so if you start with risks, you would like each of those risks to have an owner. Now, it doesn't have to be the person who is responsible for it, but it's a point of coordination for aggregation and providing risk profiles.
Okay, that's a really significant point, and it touches, I think, that's tied up, which is what we wanted to do, talk about convergence. That's tied up many of the sort of discussion which you had about, we had risk-driven compliance earlier, etc. So everything flows from the risk, and for that to work effectively, you said effective risk culture, risk ownership, and risk appetite set out in the business. So there's a lot of nodding here when you were mentioning that. So a lot of things in support. Any further comments on that either?
I can give an example of how we do it in our company. We are doing many acquisitions every year, 20, 30 acquisitions, and of course integration is a risk in itself of integration of newly acquired companies. And we use my department to go along with the line management to introduce our culture and our internal control system. I had one good example from this year. The day after we closed the deal, we went to see the management of the acquired company, and I gave us a presentation about our internal control system, and in addition about our whistleblowing system. And one of the managers of the subsidiary of the acquired company, he went back with this message to his company, and he introduced and informed about the whistleblowing procedure we have. And the result was that this summer, after a few months, I got the first whistleblowing message from that newly acquired company, and that was actually not expected. But it's an example of how you can do a little bit more than just sitting there and just audit. You can also be more active to see that our corporate culture is actually presented and understood.
Okay, thank you. Spencer?
For me as well, Ian, I think it's interesting to see how this panel plays out as well. I mean, Kenneth's background's all risk. Lorraine's background, as she said, partner at PwC and an audit committee member. And I think, for me, having come from the business, everything I tend to say is from a commercial revenue sort of perspective. For me, when we talk about the convergence, I want to be clear on what we're actually meaning by that word convergence, and it's definitely not to lose any of the independence of the third line or to merge in any way. For me, it's about removing the silos and having a consistent perspective on how we view what is essentially, in my opinion, the capital structure of an organisation. Now, I definitely agree with Ken when you see so many issues about having inconsistent risk taxonomies, you know what I mean, and one person calling it an apple and the next person calling it an orange, essentially, and it's the same thing. So for me, the real value, I think, in Convergence is having consistent perspectives and consistent classifications. And I think when you combine that with the upskilling that we've seen in audit, there's a lot of raw potential in audit that I feel is underused. And I think, especially in the last 5 years, we've seen a lot of ex-quants, for instance, moving into audit departments. And I think if we don't start to fully utilize that skill set, and I don't just mean the quants, I mean more holistically the people from the line that we've brought into audit, the quants that we've brought in, the engineers to look at the non-financial risks associated with buildings management and so forth. I think with all these blend of skill sets, I think the one thing that we do have to be careful of, in my opinion, is that we don't lose sight of why we as a company exist in the first place. Ultimately, we're a financial services company that's there to provide a service and a product to our end client. What I hope to see as one of the biggest benefits of Convergence is very much that people in the third line really understand what's motivating and driving ultimately the fears in the first line. And when we start to see the convergence around that way of thinking and the understanding and the empathy that goes with that, that's where I think we will see the real value in the Convergence.
Thank you. Excellent. Appreciate it. Okay. So as we've gone through, we've touched on a number of things. We've touched on sort of barriers, which include language taxonomy. We talked about alignment and breaking down of silos, etc. As part of this. So, you know, if you were to, before we go into some questions, we just have a few minutes left. If you were to sort of pick up a couple of best practices, some tips, things that you would recommend that people here in the room, for instance, if they go back to their businesses, think, what should I focus on first to make sure that we can drive the sort of benefits that we've spoken about? You've just mentioned, Spencer. We'll start from this end, shall we? Just work our way along. Fridthjof.
Yes. Well, the internal audit must be a bit
forward-leaning to show its competence and to make sure that people understand they can use that competence, not only for having controls, but also for being involved in projects that can be useful for the operation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think for me, Ian, would be two things in particular. One would be the strategy associated with data and the use of data.
Okay.
And then secondly would be the audit methodology in use within the third line. So to touch upon the first one first, the strategy associated with the use of data, again, comes back to the age-old, the silo structure. What we're seeing in banking at the moment is definitely a move away from that old eat what you kill model and remuneration being aligned to your desk or your own individual performance, but rather holistic performance of the organisation as a whole. And I think a similar strategy you're starting to see it seep in. I know Barclays are doing some good stuff on this. JP are doing some good stuff in it. We're doing some good stuff in it. But the whole data architecture and the data framework and the implementation of, essentially, to share an example from Deutsche, is the implementation of a data lake, where essentially it doesn't matter whether you're in the first, second or third line, you view the same data that's on the lake, essentially. And whether you're using that data to provide transaction reporting to a regulator, whether the third line are using it to do an investigation or an audit, or the second line are using it to calculate VAR or AMA or credit equivalence, it's the same data. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that DB is a single architecture, everything's streamlined. It's definitely not, but we're taking baby steps at this point in time around that whole integrated data framework. And then secondly, with the coming back to the methodology in place within a third line, I think we've seen the shift start over the last probably 5 years with the upskilling within relevant teams within audit. But I think the methodology which is in place across the industry within banking at the moment is still, it's still too much aligned to that what I would call the post-Enron Sarbanes knee-jerk reaction, which was focus 100% on test of design, test of operating effectiveness, and testing controls in isolation. For me, I'm starting to favour more sort of innovational approaches, and again, I've seen it at Barclays where they're starting to move more towards an outcome-based approach. We've seen it at some of the ideas around that is if you want to test the effectiveness of a front-to-back control environment, then done in a controlled way. There's no better way to test that control environment by booking a fictitious trade up front and watching it go through and seeing where do they catch it, now done in a controlled way. Equally, if you test in physical access controls to a key data center, again, the best way is to, in my opinion, is invasive testing and try to actually get in the same ways you see penetration testing done on the cyber side. So I think when we start to incorporate those elements into the audit methodologies, you start to then have a truly integrated approach across the first, second and third, where in the first line you're having qualitative control assessments, in the second line you're having quantitative control assessments through VAR, AMA, credit equivalents, and in the third line you're having a mixture of those two methods, but then also with some independent methods that are only used by the third line to actually validate the full end-to-end. They'd be the two areas that I'd personally focus on.
Thank you. Kenneth.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with what Spencer is saying there. So audit, we all have audit methodologies. Problem is if you've got a hammer, everything tends to look like a nail. So, we do need to move into sort of slightly smarter ways of auditing. So in my organisation at the moment, we have a thing called franchise risk audit, it follows a slightly different approach. And that's one of the ways you can attempt to get a better view of this sort of holistic governance and risk and compliance piece. In terms of best practices, I would say you need that common taxonomy and you need that common assessment framework. If you don't have that, it is very, very difficult to integrate anything.
And lastly, Lorraine.
I would probably just add a couple of practical points. Certainly I've seen examples of where activities that were initially undertaken by the third line of defence were later migrated to operational risk units within the first line of defence, so the 1.5 line of defence, basically. With a migration of the people, of the methodology, the know-how, and certainly I think that was very beneficial. It made the first line of defence more, they undertook greater ownership. And that's happened in one or two areas, so I think that's been quite an interesting practical example. And one other thing, this is again wearing my audit committee hat, is basically to host, before the audit committees, we have pre-audit committees, and which is basically to brainstorm what should be on the forthcoming agenda. And getting all lines of defence involved in that meeting, so inviting the head of risk, inviting the head of compliance, having the head of internal audit there, so that even if there are perhaps differences in the language that's used in the various reports and submissions, that you can actually really get a view on the most important risks that need to be discussed.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we've got lead from the front from your audit teams. We've got integrated data frameworks and broaden your audit methodologies. Ensure we have a common taxonomy and assessment framework. And two practical examples of use the migration of skills and knowledge and people, and certainly from day one involve all the lines of defence, which is what I'm hearing from there. So thank you very much for the panel for that. We've got just a couple of minutes. I'd like to, as you probably used to this, I'd like to open opens up for questions. So, if you have questions, if you just wait for the microphone, you'd like to just introduce your name and the company that you work for, that would be really useful. Thank you. Just behind you. Thank you.
Oh, my question is for Fridthjof. I would like to ask you if you performed operational audits with financial auditors or with other kinds of scientists like chemists, engineers.
Financial auditors, yes.
Yeah.
Did they have the knowledge to perform operational audits in your company?
No, not before. Not before they start.
But
we have
you train them to
we train
get the
them.
knowledge.
Yeah,
I see.
yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Quiet room. Question over here. Thank you.
I'm Michael from Allianz. I have a question for Spencer. Spencer, just to clarify, are you Chief Auditor and COO at the same time? As it seems to suggest this in the program.
No. I'm the Chief Auditor for Group Operations, and essentially that's all front, middle and back office over the 5 divisions at DB. So there's about, there's 20 Chief Auditors reporting into essentially the Global Head of Audit. So the COO is the name of the division as opposed to the COO for Deutsche.
I see. Okay, thank you. How do you collaborate with the other 19 divisions? Is everyone very, in terms of personnel, staffing, and also the audit universe, let's say, the risk assessment separate, or do you share all this?
Are you talking about within audit or across?
Within the 20 pillars of audit that you mentioned.
Within audit, as I'm sure there are across the street, to be honest, there's a lot of egos. There's a lot of different skill sets, and there's a variety of quality. So depending on the particular task at hand does tend to determine, I think if we think of that, I think it really depends, like whether a group-wide investigations, and for instance, some have hit the news, in particular, 2 of the ones I've been involved in have hit the news recently. We've seen awesome collaboration, not just across the divisions within audit, but cross-collaboration between first and second line, and I'd go as far as saying in the fourth and fifth lines. For me, it really comes down to what I've seen in the two and a half years in audit is it's the bedside manner of the auditor in question. You know what I mean? And coming back to that lady's question earlier on about the different skill sets, I always used to think you had to be an equity specialist to audit equities, for instance. I always thought that you had to be a risk specialist to audit risk. But what I'm saying is the really good high caliber auditors have the capacity to either retrain in a product specialism or an area specialism, as long as the firm's risk culture is receptive to that. Now, I'd say my organisation is very much at the start of that journey. Other organisations I've worked for are a little bit more further along that. But what I mean by that is, as a trader, if you're sitting in the first line and that's all you're viewing the world through is a revenue lens or a sales credit lens, and someone starts talking to you about control deficiencies, audit reports, I mean, straight away there's a difference in motive for wanting to collaborate. There's an element of fear that comes in, especially when you're in the first line. It's like, well, whatever I say is going to be used against me. You know what I mean? Whereas where I've seen this work really well is where there's no fear. You lay the cards on the table, you're open about your deficiencies, you've got a good self-assessment framework where before the audit even starts, you can say, well, look, as a desk head, not just in my product area, but in the middle and back, I'm aware of this. You demonstrate true front-to-back ownership. That's then where you make life easier almost for the auditor, because the auditor then trusts you. That builds a relationship and rapport. And then you do get into a grey area of where does the independence then come, because most of the time when I've been in the front office, the really good auditors are those that, look, the audit charter gives you, we have to open the door, but the really good ones you invite to stay for dinner is the way you'd have described and the way I'd sort of describe it. But then the really good ones have a way of managing the independence issue, but at the same time having a really collaborative bedside manner is the easiest way to describe that. Hopefully that's answered your question.
Yes, thank you. It's very informative. Am I allowed another question for Fridthjof?
Yes.
Maybe. Thank you. I found very interesting how you talked about going in the first time and assessing a new acquisition in terms of processes and company culture. I would think I sometimes have the same task or challenge. Sometimes, and I sometimes see a certain resistance in the new company to integrate or to leave their old processes alone, their old control system, and acquire, for example, the Allianz one. But you have to go to China next week, and there's going to be one such challenge again. Can you give us any recommendations, experiences that you would like to share, how to deal with that kind of resistance, or have you not encountered it at all?
Of course, it's. I think it's a very question about having good relation to the top management that are dealing with acquisitions. If the top manager is going to introduce himself and our company to the new acquired company, I ask that I say that I would like to accompany him, and he thinks that is a good idea, because I know much more about internal control than he does. So it's much better to be upfront and telling about how things should be than coming after 1 year and telling you're doing it the wrong way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I think that draws the session to a close, and we've run out of time. But thank you very much. I'd like to thank Fridthjof Roer, Spencer John, Kenneth Wainwright, and Lorraine Scaramanga for their contributions. Thank you.